Hello, if you're watching this, it means you've read A Midwinter Promise. So thank you very much, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I found this book had many layers to it for me, and particularly I was interested in the modern story about the relationship between a stepmother and the stepchildren. And it was important to me that there was something very multi-layered about that relationship, and that the more you learned about the past, the more you were able to bring different aspects of the story. And someone who seems quite cold and cruel and maybe a little bit uncomprehending, once you begin to see their motivations and see what they did in the past, then you can become a little bit more sympathetic towards them, and you can see it a bit more from their point of view. So Sally, at the beginning, we see only through Alex's eyes and Johnny's eyes, and they both have very difficult feelings about her. Johnny's are more hatred, and Alex's are more sort of fear, mixed in with a kind of just deep sadness that she couldn't ever make a relationship with Sally or understand why Sally wanted to keep her from her father. And so it's really easy to hate Sally at the start, but then we get to see her in the past, and we see that in fact some of what she did she thought she was doing for the best. She is only human, and she made some mistakes, but she certainly got punished for them in the form of her son, Mundo. Someone who read the novel very early on said to me, well, Mundo, she's obviously a great mother. And I thought, that wasn't exactly how I wrote her. In fact, she is not a great mother, and that is one of her tragedies, is she can't really relate either to her son or to Alex and Johnny, and that has created waves of pain that have gone through the generations. And in trying to do the best for David, who's the absolute centre of her world, she's really hurt two people who didn't deserve it. But I hope that by the end, we've learned a little bit about who she was and why she did what she did. One of the great sadnesses for Sally is that she knows deep down inside that David really loved Julia the best. And all Julia had to do was snap her fingers, and David would have gone running back and he'd have left Sally in an instant. And she always knew that. And if Julia had any kind of revenge on Sally, it was that. One of the reasons I have dedicated this novel to my mother is that she sent me a snippet from a newspaper and said, I saw this and I thought you might find it interesting for a book. And I thought, that's not for me, that's for a thriller writer. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought that this aspect of a woman's life, which is getting pregnant and having a baby, is almost always thought about as a very positive thing and a very joyful thing. But the woman in this snippet had not found it that way at all. In fact, she'd given birth to babies and then hidden them. She hadn't killed them, but they had died eventually. And that grew into what it would be like if you had a very deep-seated fear of having a baby. And there is a term for that, and it is tocophobia, which is mentioned in the book, a fear of pregnancy and childbirth. And because of the traumatic events in Julia's past, she suffers from this fear that becomes more and more acute as she gets older, as she grows into womanhood, as she approaches pregnancy and motherhood herself. And Julia's great tragedy of tocophobia is the dual nature of the fear. She fears the baby living and she fears the baby dying. So she's in a terrible, terrible bond. And that is what really sends her close to a kind of madness, well, at least a very severe mental illness from which she suffers. And it's progressive too. So she does recover from her first experience, but with the second, which she thinks she can control. And for me, that was one of the saddest aspects of the book, is that she can't bring herself to tell anyone that it's happening again. She's even more out of control with that one. And because of its progressive nature, that's what really tips her over the edge when she reaches what she believes is a third pregnancy she can't take that experience, which she knows will be worse, one more time. In going into that area, I realised I was going to be writing about an experience that people really have that's very damaging and dangerous. So I did research it very carefully. And then when Julia began to suffer from it, I found it so real and so distressing, it was very difficult to write. But I hope it rings true and that it manages to convey some of what that terrible suffering must be like. I'm very interested in writing about issues of inheritance because this happens to nearly everybody, not in huge ways to do with an enormous house, but often in just things like a favourite piece of furniture or a little bit of jewellery or something like that. And it's extraordinary how it can break families apart and how this kind of issue of who gets what can create so much drama and trauma. So I think we can kind of relate to it a bit. It's one of those things that it's very difficult to deal with in advance because it's the kind of thing you almost feel like saying to somebody, I've been thinking about when you're dead and this is what we'd like to happen. And because it seems to be a little bit nasty to talk about that, we just don't broach the subject early enough, and that's part of what leads to all these problems afterwards. So what makes it poignant in this case is that it was actually Julia's house and not David's, and he was just the custodian of it, and somehow he's kind of been able to, they think, dispose of the house. Later they discover that he was not able to do any such thing, and that they now have the power to use their inheritance to get their revenge on the person that they think was doing them wrong. And that kind of sets lots of other things in motion, and I found that all very interesting. And actually, for me, it was Alex saying, let's let it go, let's do what Pa would have wanted, that brought about that voice of common sense that sometimes we all need to bring into those issues and sort it all out. I often have to look at ways to tie the present and the past together, and sometimes I do that through an object, and quite a lot these things are done through diaries and letters, and I've always tried to steer clear of those a little bit, not because they're no good, but because you need to tie them a lot into the story, and often I don't want to do that. So in this case, I was trying to think of a way, not just that we could tie the two stories together, but also we could provide a missing link, and in this case it was Lala. And so the idea of the mural came to me. And when the artist, Monsieur de Pelly, arrived to do it, he actually, the character, which sounds incredibly pretentious, but he came along and kind of gave me all those ideas for the matchboxes and the hidden messages and the little message that he invented from Julia's mother to her, saying, you are my life. And I really enjoyed writing that bit, but most of all, I loved having them find it again in the future and having it link everything together. It was really satisfying.